with the brand new big screen adaptation starring Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi. Wuthering Heights is back in the zeitgeist. Between its casting choices, aesthetic, and storytelling, this new adaptation has generated a lot of controversy. But controversy is nothing new when it comes to this classic story of love, obsession, and revenge. From its initial publication in 1847, Wuthering Heights has shocked, scared, and captivated generations of readers. And in this 3-part deep dive from the 2 a.m. Book Review Club, we'll be going back to the original text. We'll explore the characters, themes, and nuances of Emily Bronte's complex and layered narrative. And we'll discuss why 179 years after its publication, the world is still obsessed with Wuthering Heights. This is our final episode, episode 3. Content warning for domestic abuse, domestic violence, suicide, kidnapping, and desecration of a grave, as in digging up dead bodies. Yes, things will get weird in this episode. Part 1, The Things We Do for Love, or the story of Kathy Linton and Linton Heathcliff. Last time we left the Linton household at Thrushcross Grange, trouble was in the air. Edgar Linton was very ill. Kathy had been secretly corresponding with Heathcliff's son, Linton, and our trusty narrator, Nellie Dean, after discovering this secret stash of letters, had forced Kathy to burn the letters and stop corresponding with Linton. But will this really put a stop to Kathy and Linton's budding relationship? Obviously not. In chapter 22, when Kathy and Nellie run into Heathcliff while on a walk, Heathcliff tells her that Linton misses Kathy, that he, quote, dreams of you day and night, and that he is, quote, dying for you. Nellie tries to tell Kathy that Heathcliff is lying, but eventually Kathy convinces Nellie to pay a visit to Wuthering Heights. In chapter 23, Kathy and Nellie go to Wuthering Heights, where Kathy and Linton argue, make up, then argue some more. On the way home, Nellie catches a terrible cold that keeps her in bed for the next 3 weeks. In chapter 24, Nellie recovers, but she soon discovers that during her illness, Kathy has been sneaking away to Wuthering Heights every single night to see Linton. Nellie, feeling that things are getting out of control, finally tells Edgar what's going on, and he bans Kathy from visiting Wuthering Heights again. In chapter 25, Linton himself writes to Edgar, begging to see Kathy again. Edgar, knowing that he is dying, agrees to let Linton and Kathy meet on the moors. In chapter 26, Kathy and Linton meet with Nellie as their chaperone, but Kathy is disappointed to discover that Linton's health is much, much worse. And also, it seems like he doesn't really want to meet with her. In chapter 27, Kathy and Linton, per their previous agreement, meet again. Linton seems no more happy to see Kathy than before, but this time Heathcliff shows up. Heathcliff coerces Nellie and Kathy to return with him to Wuthering Heights, where he kidnaps and imprisons them. He tells Kathy that she'll marry Linton whether or not she wants to, and that she won't be allowed to go home to see her dying father. When Kathy tries to convince him to let her go, Heathcliff violently attacks her. That night, Nellie and Kathy are locked up together in an upstairs room. The next morning, Kathy is let out of the room, but Nellie remains imprisoned there for the next 5 nights. In chapter 28, Nellie is finally released from her prison, and she discovers that Kathy and Linton are now married. Linton tells Nellie that Kathy is locked up in one of the upstairs rooms, but he refuses to tell her which room. Defeated, Nellie returns to Thrushcross Grange, where Edgar is dying but not yet dead. That night, Kathy manages to escape Wuthering Heights just in time to say goodbye to her beloved father. In chapter 29, Heathcliff shows up at Thrushcross Grange to bring Kathy back to Wuthering Heights, and he refuses to allow Nellie to accompany them. Then, in chapter 30, through the perspective of the Wuthering Heights housekeeper Zillah, we learn that Linton Heathcliff, who has always struggled with chronic illness, has died at the age of 17. Heathcliff refuses to call a doctor and refuses to allow anyone but Kathy to look after his son, meaning that Kathy has to be alone with Linton in his final hours. Afterward, she tells Heathcliff, quote, "You have left me so long to struggle against death alone, that I feel and see only death. I feel like death." And so, finally, we're brought up to date. We are brought up to 1801, the point in the timeline when Lockwood first arrives at Wuthering Heights. After 200 plus pages of betrayal, obsession, and revenge, we understand the fraught dynamic at Wuthering Heights and why these people all seem to hate each other so much. But, okay, that was a lot. A lot was happening. A lot was going on. So let's back up a moment and take a closer look at what is going on here. First, let's acknowledge just how much happens in such an insanely compacted timeline. Over the course of just 9 chapters, Kathy Linton goes from having a secret relationship with her cousin Linton to becoming Heathcliff's prisoner, to being forced to marry Linton, to watching her father die, to caring for Linton before he too dies. And all of this happens over the course of just a few weeks. If Kathy Linton's behavior towards Lockwood or Hareton Earnshaw ever seems erratic or rude, let's not forget that she has had to endure far more trauma than any 17-year-old should ever have to go through. However, the other thing I want to point out here is that Kathy Linton is not entirely without agency in these events. She is the one who carries on a secret relationship with Linton. She is the one who persuades Nellie to visit Wuthering Heights. She is the one who persuades her father to let her meet with Linton. And although she would have preferred to marry Linton on her own terms, in her own time, after her father's death, she does tell Heathcliff that he doesn't have to force her to marry Linton because she will do so willingly, of her own accord. By this point in the story, Heathcliff sees himself as the ultimate puppet master, and he sees Linton as a useful tool in pursuing his plan of total revenge. And at every step along the way, we do see Heathcliff pulling the strings. In chapter 21, for example, when Nellie uncovers Cathy and Linton's secret correspondence, she notes that Linton's letters are, quote, singularly odd compounds of ardor and flatness, commencing in strong feeling and concluding in the affected, wordy style that a schoolboy might use to a fancied, incorporeal sweetheart. Tellingly, she notes that there are, quote, touches here and there, which I thought were borrowed from a more experienced source. In chapter 22, after Cathy has promised to Nellie to put a stop to her secret relationship with Linton, it is Heathcliff who persuades her to see his son again, which rekindles Cathy and Linton's relationship. In chapter 25, when Nellie has persuaded Edgar to put his foot down and put a stop to the relationship, Linton writes to Edgar, begging to see Cathy again. Yet again, Nellie detects Heathcliff's hand behind this letter. She tells us that the contents of Linton's letter clearly reflect his father's instructions. In chapter 27, Heathcliff finally comes out from behind the scenes and takes decisive charge by literally kidnapping Cathy and Nellie. From this point on, Cathy's agency is taken away, and Heathcliff has almost total control over her life. And yet, despite all of Heathcliff's machinations, none of his plans would have ultimately worked out if Cathy Linton had not formed a real emotional connection to Linton Heathcliff. But the thing is, right, Cathy and Linton have, at least in my opinion, the strangest relationship in the entire book. Now, granted, Wuthering Heights is full of strange and toxic relationships. Let's take Hindley and Frances Earnshaw, for example. Hindley and Frances Earnshaw are so obsessed with each other that when Frances dies, Hindley is completely unable to process her death, leading him to a downward spiral of alcohol, gambling, violence, and abuse. Heathcliff is brutally abusive towards his wife, Isabella Linton, and Cathy Linton's own parents, Catherine Earnshaw and Edgar Linton, had a shallow and somewhat one-sided marriage. Then, of course, there is Heathcliff and Catherine Earnshaw's iconic toxic relationship, which began as mutual codependency in an abusive household, and which somehow has now spiraled into this ultimate, all-encompassing revenge quest in pursuit of some mysterious goal, whatever that is. But even compared to all of these previous examples, Cathy and Linton's relationship is so strange that at times it seems almost incomprehensible. The first time that we see Cathy and Linton interact at length is in chapter 23. Now, at this point in time, nothing really bad has happened yet. Cathy has been caught exchanging letters with Linton and has promised Nellie to break the relationship off, until Heathcliff tells her that Linton misses and wants to see her. And so, in chapter 23, Cathy and Nellie visit Wuthering Heights. Cathy and Linton spend most of this visit fighting They fight over whether Isabella left Heathcliff because he was cruel to her. They fight over whether Catherine Earnshaw and Edgar Linton really loved each other. And they also fight over whether Catherine Earnshaw and Heathcliff had feelings for each other. I actually love this scene. I think it's really funny. And I think it's funny because we see these relationships that played out so dramatically and so tragically in the first 100 or so pages of the book now being turned into gossip by these teenagers. Gossip that they argue over because they weren't there. They weren't alive, and so they don't know what actually happened between Catherine Earnshaw, Edgar Linton, Isabella Linton, and Heathcliff. I mean, to be fair, I was here for the complete ride, and I'm not entirely sure I understand all of the nuances in these complicated relationships, but this argument over decades-old gossip gets so heated and so violent that Linton almost kicks Cathy out of the house. Now, this scene is funny, but it also shows us that fundamentally, Linton and Cathy don't really have compatible personalities. Linton is whiny and taunting and unempathetic, and Cathy is immature and spoiled and overconfident. In this scene, we see a pattern develop that will come to characterize their relationship. Anytime they try to have a conversation about anything, it will inevitably devolve into petty arguments and mutual annoyance. But when Cathy stops trying to talk to Linton and instead starts taking care of him, they get along just fine. When Cathy and Linton finally calm down after their argument about their parents and their weird love square situation, whatever it was they had going on, Linton says to her, quote, "Sit on the settle and let me lean on your knee. That's as Mama used to do, whole afternoons together. Sit quite still and don't talk. But you may sing a song, if you can sing, or you may say a nice, long, interesting ballad. One of those you promised to teach me, or a story. I'd rather have a ballad, though. Begin." So bossy. He's like, "I'd rather have a ballad, though. Begin." Now, what you probably are noticing about this dynamic is that it is very far from being a romantic one. Cathy tells Linton, in fact, that she can't imagine loving anyone more than her father. And even though she is an idealistic teenager, she still knows that not all marriages are happy ones. More importantly, we see through her words and actions that she is not envisioning Linton as like a partner and an equal. She is instead seeing him as a younger sibling that needs to be taken care of. As Cathy tells Linton while she is, quote, stroking his long soft hair, quote, "Pretty Linton, I wish you were my brother." Remember, Cathy and Linton are cousins. And while marrying your cousin was considered socially acceptable in 19th century England, the editor of my copy of Wuthering Heights, and I'm reading the soft paperback Barnes & Noble's Classics edition, the editor, Tatiana Holloway, is correct to identify these cousin relationships as at least quasi-incestuous. I really like this word, quasi-incestuous. Particularly in the case of Cathy and Linton, their relationship is, from the very beginning far more sibling-like than it is explicitly romantic. They fight like siblings. Linton depends on Kathy like a demanding younger sibling. And yet, we know that these two teenagers are heading almost inevitably towards marriage. In chapter 24, Nellie realizes that Kathy has been secretly visiting Linton at Wuthering Heights. Kathy freely confesses to everything, and once again, we see exactly the same relationship pattern as we did in chapter 23. Kathy and Linton's attempts at conversation inevitably devolve into arguments. Kathy spends most of her time taking care of Linton, and she even tells Nellie that, quote, "About 3 times, I think, we have been merry and hopeful, as we were the first evening. The rest of my visits were dreary and troubled." Like the reader, Nellie is intensely confused as to why Kathy is attracted to Linton, why she can't seem to leave him alone. Because it's not that Kathy can't see Linton for who he is. Like her mother before her, Kathy Linton is clear-sighted and level-headed, and she recognizes that Linton will never change. She tells Nellie, quote, "He'll never let his friends be at ease, and he'll never be at ease himself." And yet, Kathy feels that whatever Linton does, she must forgive him. Whatever Linton does, she can't abandon him. Like I said, to an outsider, it is an intensely confusing dynamic. But there are a couple of key factors to note here. The first thing I need to point out is the isolation of this community. The only people Kathy Linton actually seems to know are her father, Nellie, Heathcliff, Linton, Hareton, and the servants. Of these people, the only one that is her own age and that she sees as a social equal is Linton Heathcliff. Assuming that Linton Heathcliff outlives his father, he stands to inherit both money and property. He has received an education comparable to Kathy's, and like a true Linton, he is fair-skinned, blonde-haired, and blue-eyed. In other words, he is the kind of boy Kathy feels that she should like, that she should be attracted to. However, there is also another factor here, which is Kathy Linton's personality. Fundamentally, Kathy is a kind person, a caring person, and a people pleaser. She is an only child who is devoted to her father. She is a girl who has deep sympathy for people who struggle with chronic illness. And unfortunately, she is someone who really, really, really wants people to like her. I think we can say with certainty that the vast majority of teenage girls would not find Linton Heathcliff attractive. But Kathy Linton is uniquely positioned to find Linton not just sympathetic, but also the only person she can realistically view as a potential marriage partner. Kathy sees Linton for who he is. The problem here is not that she doesn't see the red flags. In fact, in chapters 26 and 27, I would argue that she comes close to breaking off the relationship altogether. In chapter 26, Kathy and Linton have at last received permission from Edgar to meet on the moors under Nellie's supervision. But when they do meet, Kathy is disappointed to find that Linton seems like he doesn't even want to be there. Catherine perceived, Nellie tells us, as well as I did, that he held it rather a punishment than a gratification to endure our company. Kathy herself says to Nellie, quote, I'm hardly going to come to give Mr. Heathcliff pleasure. Linton admits to Kathy that he is meeting with her not because he wants to, but because if he doesn't, his father will become even more abusive than he usually is. Kathy retorts that she doesn't, quote, stand in awe of Mr. Heathcliff, but for Linton's sake, she returns one final time in chapter 27. And right up until the moment Heathcliff arrives to kidnap her, Kathy seems determined to leave Linton and possibly break off the relationship entirely. Why cannot you say at once you don't want me? She asks him. When she says she's going to return home, Linton breaks down entirely. With streaming face and an expression of agony, Nellie tells us, Linton had thrown his nerveless frame along the ground. He seemed convulsed with exquisite terror. Linton calls himself a traitor, and of course he is, because just a few minutes later, Heathcliff shows up to kidnap Kathy, and it's too late. Too late to flee, too late to break off her relationship with Linton, too late to make any choices about her own future. Both Nellie Dean, our trusty narrator, and Edgar Linton, Kathy's beloved father, assume that Linton is completely under his father's control, that he has no feelings or agency of his own. But if Kathy believed that Linton were simply his father's tool, she would never have developed feelings for him. And I do use the word feelings intentionally because whatever she feels for him, it is a confused mixture of affection and annoyance and anxiety. You know, I just had this random thought that Sigmund Freud would have loved the Kathy Linton relationship, particularly because it is noted by several characters that Linton looks exactly like Edgar. Multiple people say that he looks like Edgar's younger brother. Anyway, a random thought. And yet, in chapter 28, Linton does reveal himself to be not just his father's tool, but also his father's son, because it's not enough that Kathy is kidnapped from her home, imprisoned at Wuthering Heights, and forced to marry Linton. No, Linton has to turn out to be a cruel and abusive husband who treats Kathy very similarly to how Heathcliff once treated Isabella. Well, minus the physical abuse, because Linton is, suffering from chronic illness. But don't worry, Heathcliff can step in and do the physical abuse for him. Oh, God. Okay. Sometimes I'm just talking very rationally and analytically about Wuthering Heights. And then I just have this realization that this is a very violent and intense story. Okay. In chapter 28, Nellie, who, remember, was brought to Wuthering Heights along with Kathy, is finally released from the room in which she was imprisoned for 5 days, and she goes in search of Kathy. She finds only Linton, who tells her that Kathy is still imprisoned upstairs. She's not to go, Linton tells Nellie. We won't let her. Nellie is angry. She says to Linton, "You won't let her, little idiot." She demands to be taken to Kathy, but Linton again refuses. And we get a heartbreaking look into just how terrible the first few days of Kathy's married life have been. Heathcliff has told Linton that Kathy is essentially his property. He says, "I'm not to be soft with Catherine," Linton tells Nellie, adding that, quote, "he says she hates me and wants me to die that she may have my money, but she shan't have it, and she shan't go home. She never shall." Linton has really absorbed this patriarchal mindset. He knows that his uncle Edgar is dying, and he says, listen to what he says, okay? Quote, "I'm glad, for I shall be master of the Grange after him. Catherine always spoke of it as her house. It isn't hers, it's mine. Papa says everything she has is mine." In fact, he goes so far as to compare Kathy to a dog or a horse, after describing an instance in which Heathcliff struck Kathy down. That is, he hit Kathy so hard that she fell down. Linton tells Nellie that he winked, meaning he ignored it, just as, quote, "I wink to see my father strike a dog or a horse." He tells Nellie that far from feeling bad that Heathcliff hit Kathy, far from feeling bad that Heathcliff hit Kathy so hard that her mouth filled with blood, he is actually glad that it happened because, and I quote, "she deserved punishment." And what has Kathy done to deserve punishment from Linton's point of view? Well, Linton tried to steal Kathy's necklace, which contained portraits of her parents, and she tried to stop him by pushing him away. Now, Linton will eventually help Kathy escape Wuthering Heights so that she can see her dying father, but in my opinion, it is too little, too late. Now, like all of the characters in Wuthering Heights, Linton Heathcliff is a complicated person. He has struggled with chronic illness his entire life. He lost his mother at a young age. He has had to live with Heathcliff as his primary parent. And he knows that he is not likely to live a long life. He never had a chance at an ordinary life, quote unquote ordinary. He never got to be just a kid. And it is a poignant moment when he tells Kathy early on in their relationship, quote, "I am worthless and bad in temper and bad in spirit, almost always. And if you choose, you may say goodbye. You'll get rid of an annoyance. Only, Catherine, do me this justice. Believe that if I might be as sweet and as kind and as good as you are, I would be as willingly and more so than as happy and as healthy." In moments like these, I do feel for Linton, but none of this excuses his bad behavior, right? Especially after his marriage to Kathy, his behavior becomes inexcusable. And I do ultimately think that his insecurities, pettiness, and inability to empathize do get the best of him. Linton Heathcliff does die in chapter 30, and to the very end, somehow, Kathy manages to hold on to her empathy for him. When Heathcliff asks her how she feels, the very first thing she says is that Linton is now safe. Even after all of the pain and suffering that Linton caused her, Kathy still does not see him as entirely his father's puppet. She still sees Linton as a vulnerable teenager who is now beyond the reach of his abusive and controlling father. And yet, perhaps inevitably, the violence, trauma, and death that she has experienced over the past 4 chapters have begun to warp and morph her into someone unrecognizable. In chapter 29, Heathcliff comes to Thrushcross Grange after Edgar's funeral to bring Kathy back to Wuthering Heights. At this point, Linton is still alive, and Kathy and Heathcliff have a brief back and forth regarding him. Heathcliff says gleefully that they will not have a pleasant reunion, as Linton is angry with Kathy for leaving Wuthering Heights. Kathy fires right back. Kathy, in moments like these, she really is her mother's daughter. "I know he has a bad nature," said Catherine. "He's your son. But I'm glad I've a better to forgive it. And I know he loves me, and for that reason, I love him. Mr. Heathcliff, you have nobody to love you, and however miserable you make us, we shall still have the revenge of thinking that your cruelty arises from your greater misery. You are miserable, are you not? Lonely like the devil, and envious like him. Nobody loves you. Nobody will cry for you when you die. I wouldn't be you." Catherine spoke with a kind of dreary triumph. She seemed to have made up her mind to enter into the spirit of her future family and draw pleasure from the griefs of her enemies. Ultimately, like Hareton Earnshaw, like Linton Heathcliff, Kathy Linton becomes just another victim in Heathcliff's never-ending quest for revenge. Kathy becomes yet another casualty of the complicated interpersonal relationships that she doesn't even fully understand. And she is made to pay for events that happened long before her birth. And at some point, we have to ask, what does Heathcliff have to do? How far does he have to go for somebody to step in and do something about it? Part 2, when inaction becomes complicity. As Heathcliff's actions become increasingly erratic, violent, and sometimes criminal, kidnapping, a major theme that emerges is the idea of complicity. For all of Nellie Dean's faults, she is far more often guilty of doing too much rather than too little. She has no real authority or social status because she is a servant, but when she's convinced that something bad is happening, she intervenes. And if somebody she cares about is in danger, she always steps in. This is why Heathcliff kidnaps both Nellie and Kathy, and why, once they're trapped inside Wuthering Heights, he separates them. Similarly, when Heathcliff shows up to take Kathy back to Wuthering Heights following Edgar Linton's death, Heathcliff refuses to allow Nellie to go with them. Nellie cares deeply for Kathy Linton, and Heathcliff, knowing that Nellie will do her best to protect Kathy, does his best to separate them. With Nellie out of the picture, There is nobody left to protect Kathy. The housekeeper at Wuthering Heights, a woman named Zilla, doesn't really care about what happens to her or anyone else. I always refused to meddle, she tells Nellie. And when Heathcliff forces Kathy to look after a dying Linton alone, the incident that seems to traumatize her more than anything else, Zilla doesn't even try to intervene. After Linton's death, Kathy remains upstairs alone for the next 2 weeks, trying to process her grief. When she finally comes downstairs, we learn that she blames everyone at Wuthering Heights for abandoning her when she would have given anything to have someone with her. Quote, "Mr. Hareton and the whole set of you will be good enough to understand that I reject any pretense at kindness. You have the hypocrisy to offer. I despise you and will have nothing to say to any of you, when I would have given my life for one kind word, even to see one of your faces. You all kept off." This is the reason Kathy can't forgive either Hareton or Zilla. This is why she becomes the haughty, cold, cynical young woman that Lockwood found at Wuthering Heights all the way back in chapter 2. It is true that Hareton and Zilla are legitimately afraid of disobeying Heathcliff, but at some point, inaction simply becomes complicity. And then, of course, let's not forget our original narrator, Mr. Lockwood. This whole time, he's been eagerly listening to Nellie Dean's story of how Wuthering Heights came to be the way it is today, a narrative that wraps up in chapter 30. Inspired by Nellie's sympathetic portrayal of Kathy Linton, and also by Nellie's hints that such a beautiful young lady would surely make somebody, hint hint, somebody, a wonderful wife, Lockwood goes back to Wuthering Heights in chapter 31. He attempts to strike up a conversation with Kathy, but she pays far more attention to fighting with Hareton than she does to speaking with him. Rather than reflecting on why Kathy might be distrustful of strangers, or why it might take more than one half-hearted conversation to win her trust, Lockwood instead decides that Nellie was too biased towards Kathy. She does not seem so amiable, he thinks to himself, as Mrs. Dean would persuade me to believe. She's a beauty, it is true, but not an angel. When Heathcliff tells Kathy to have her dinner in the kitchen and she obeys without arguing, Lockwood doesn't think that maybe she is grateful for any opportunity to escape Heathcliff. Instead, he blames Kathy for depriving him of the ability to further speak with her. Living among clowns and misanthropists, he reflects, she probably cannot appreciate a better class of people when she meets them. But why should Kathy consider Lockwood to be a better class of people? All she knows of him is that he comes from the big city and that he has enough money to rent out Thrushcross Grange. But that tells her nothing about who he really is or why he is inherently more trustworthy than the other people around her. Realistically, there's no reason why Kathy should suddenly decide to be friendly with Lockwood. Lockwood ends chapter 31 with the decision to leave the Yorkshire moors permanently. He hasn't really enjoyed his visit, and he doesn't think he'll ever return. As he leaves, however, he does take a moment to feel bad for Kathy. How dreary life gets over in that house, I reflected while riding down the road. What a realization of something more romantic than a fairy tale it would have been for Mrs. Linton Heathcliff had she and I struck up an attachment as her good nurse desired and migrated together into the stirring atmosphere of the town. Allow me to take a moment to point out just how self-centered Lockwood is being here. During his stay at Thrushcross Grange, Lockwood never actually tried to help Kathy, and even in chapter 31, the only helpful thing he actually does is to deliver a letter from Nellie. He doesn't propose to Kathy, he doesn't offer to help her in any way, and all of this despite being the only person in the story who could have had a real impact on Kathy Linton's life. Sure, Kathy is unlikely to have accepted an offer of a marriage from a stranger she's only met twice. But you know what she would have accepted? What she would have appreciated? Some legal help to get back the property that belongs to her. Let me explain what I'm talking about. Nellie tells Lockwood that Linton left all of his money to his father in his will, but because he died before reaching the age of majority, he was not able to sign over his lands to Heathcliff. This means that now that Linton is dead, Kathy inherited all of Linton's property, including Thrushcross Grange. However, because she is essentially a prisoner at Wuthering Heights, and because everyone in the neighborhood is terrified of Heathcliff, no one will help her claim her legal rights. But you know who is wealthy, well-connected, and an outsider beyond the reach of Heathcliff's power? That's right, one Mr. Lockwood. Even without marrying her, Lockwood could have improved Kathy's life by simply connecting her to an attorney. But apparently, the idea doesn't even occur to him, despite the fact that Nellie takes the trouble to highlight Kathy's legal plight several times. Obviously, Lockwood has no obligation to help a stranger, but the fact that he can simply walk away from Kathy knowing in detail everything that has happened to her, knowing in detail how bleak her future is, does show, at least to me, that Lockwood is just as complicit as everyone else. By the time we reach the end of chapter 31, Wuthering Heights has developed a deeply cynical view of human nature. People turn from victims to abusers. Outsiders are not so much neutral as complicit, and nobody can stop Heathcliff from taking out his revenge on anyone and everyone who is even remotely connected to the long-dead Catherine Earnshaw. But does Heathcliff really have complete control, or is it just possible that even in an environment as toxic and dysfunctional as Wuthering Heights, we can still find hope? Part 3. Do people change? Or the story of Kathy and Hareton. If Kathy Linton was always sympathetic towards Linton Heathcliff, she was always distinctly unsympathetic towards her other cousin, Hareton Earnshaw. In fact, as a child, Kathy refused to acknowledge Hareton as her cousin, referring to Linton as her real cousin. One of Kathy's biggest faults is that she's really her father's daughter. She is a superficial person who largely judges people based on their appearance, education, and social status. If Linton was raised to be pretty and well-educated, Hareton was raised to be rough, illiterate, and ill-mannered. Linton would have inherited a good deal of money and property if he had lived, but Hareton has had everything taken away from him by Heathcliff. Therefore, in Kathy's worldview, Linton is her social equal, and Hareton is far below her. Now, while Kathy and Linton's ill-fated relationship was playing out, Hareton was always lurking somewhere in the background. In chapter 24, when Kathy tells Nellie about her secret visits to Wuthering Heights, she takes a break from talking about Linton to describe an incident in which she laughed at Hareton for trying to learn how to read. Nellie, rightfully, scolds Kathy for this. She tells her, quote, "To sneer at his imperfect attempt was very bad breeding. Had you been brought up in his circumstances, would you be less rude? He was as quick and as intelligent a child as ever you were, and I'm hurt that he should be despised now because that base Heathcliff has treated him so unjustly." Unfortunately, this lecture does not make any impression on Kathy. In chapter 30, when Kathy is still emotionally devastated over Linton's death, Hareton tries to make friends with her, arguing that he did ask Heathcliff multiple times if he could help Kathy watch over Linton. But Kathy rejects Hareton entirely, telling him, quote, "Be silent. I'll go out of doors or anywhere rather than have your disagreeable voice in my ear." Hareton tells her to go to hell, and that is that, at least for now. In chapter 31, when Lockwood visits Wuthering Heights to tell Heathcliff that he's leaving, Kathy and Hareton get into a massive fight. Kathy accuses Hareton of stealing her books, despite the fact that he can't read, or at least can't read well. Quote, "They are of no use to you, or else you concealed them in the bad spirit that, as you cannot enjoy them, nobody else shall." Lockwood tries to intervene on Hareton's behalf. He tells Nellie that Hareton is only trying to improve his education, and Kathy's response is to make fun of Hareton. She says that she has heard Hareton trying to practice reading out loud and that he has made her beloved books, quote, "ridiculous to me with his vile mistakes and mispronunciations." Hareton, mortified and angry, tries to give Kathy's books back to her, but she refuses to take them back. She continues to make fun of Hareton, mocking the way he struggles to read. And Hareton, maybe to no one's surprise, ends up hitting her. Again, that is the behavior that has been modeled to him, right? Just as this kind of social snobbery has been modeled to Kathy by her father. As Lockwood tells us, quote, "The little wretch had done her utmost to hurt her cousin's sensitive, though uncultivated, feelings, and a physical argument was the only mode he had of balancing the account and repaying its effects on the inflictor." Let's be clear here, right? Both Kathy and Hareton behave badly in this scene. Neither of them is really better than the other, but Kathy did start the fight. Afterwards, Hareton burns Kathy's books, a symbolic indication that he has given up on trying to educate himself and on trying to make friends with Kathy. You know, on second thought, maybe it's not so surprising that Lockwood doesn't try harder to help Kathy. She's not exactly being approachable. Again, chapter 31 reinforces a deeply cynical conception of human nature. Kathy has been Heathcliff's victim, but now she turns around and takes out her pain on Hareton. As Zillah puts it, quote, "The more hurt she gets, the more venomous she grows." I really like this quote. It is such a perfect encapsulation of the cycle of abuse. So what we see playing out here is the exact same cycle of violence and toxicity that has played out time and again throughout Wuthering Heights. And by the end of chapter 31, it seems that no one will ever be able to break it. In chapter 32, we skip ahead a year and a half to September 1802. Lockwood happens to be in the north of England, and he remembers that his lease on Thrushcross Grange has not yet expired. And so, being in the neighborhood, he decides to spend one final night there. When he arrives at the Grange, however, he finds that it's deserted. Nellie Dean has gone, and the new housekeeper tells him that Nellie now lives, guess where? At Wuthering Heights. Lockwood, as curious and nosy as ever, heads over to Wuthering Heights, where he finds a curious sight. Both doors and lattices were open, and yet, as is usually the case in a coal district, a fine red fire illumined the chimney. The comfort which the eye derives from it renders the extra heat endurable. But the House of Wuthering Heights is so large that the inmates have plenty of space for withdrawing out of its influence, and accordingly, what inmates there were had stationed themselves not far from one of the windows. I could both see them and hear them talk before I entered, and looked and listened in consequence, being moved thereto by a mingled sense of curiosity and envy that grew as I lingered. "Contrary," said a voice, as sweet as a silver bell, "that for the third time, you dunce! I'm not going to tell you again. Recollect, or I'll pull your hair." "Contrary, then," answered another, in deep but softened tones. "And now kiss me for minding so well." "No, read it over first, correctly, without a single mistake." The male speaker began to read. He was a young man, respectably dressed, and seated at a table, having a book before him. His handsome features glowed with pleasure, and his eyes kept impatiently wandering from the page to a small white hand over his shoulder, which recalled him by a smart slap on the cheek whenever its owner detected such signs of inattention. Its owner stood behind him, her light, shining ringlets blending at intervals with his brown locks, as she bent to superintend his studies, and her face. It was lucky he could not see her face, or he would never have been so steady. I could, and I bit my lip in spite at having thrown away the chance I might have had of doing something besides staring at its smiting beauty. The task was done, not free from further blunders, but the pupil claimed the reward and received at least 5 kisses, which, however, he generously returned. Then they came to the door, and from their conversation, I judged they were about to issue out and have a walk on the moors. I supposed I should be condemned in Hareton Earnshaw's heart, if not by his mouth, to the lowest pit in the infernal regions, if I showed my unfortunate person in his neighborhood then, and feeling very mean and malignant, I skulked around to seek refuge in the kitchen. There was unobstructed admittance on that side also, and at the door sat my old friend, Nellie Dean, sewing and singing a song. Nellie is happy happy to see Lockwood and is even more happy to tell him that, yes, Hareton and Kathy are now together. She tells him triumphantly that, quote, it was easy enough to win Mrs. Heathcliff's heart. And in true Nellie Dean fashion, she launches into a full narrative of how Kathy and Hareton finally managed to become friends and then something more. Because I know you're wondering, how on earth could these two have come back from all the terrible things they have said and done to each other? Nellie tells us that 2 weeks after Lockwood's departure, Heathcliff finally got so tired of having Kathy constantly around that he asked Nellie to come to Wuthering Heights. Nellie, of course, was overjoyed to be asked. She moved into Wuthering Heights and set about trying to make Kathy as comfortable and as happy as possible. She set up a little room for her and Kathy to sit in. She brought Nellie books. She hung out with Kathy as much as possible. And yet, she observes that so many months into Kathy's imprisonment at Wuthering Heights, she's restless and lonely. Of course, she now has Nellie, but Nellie, being the housekeeper, does sometimes have things to do. Nellie notes that when she first arrived at Wuthering Heights, she found Kathy, quote, altered so much. But after Nellie's arrival, we see Kathy slowly return to the light-hearted, mischievous girl she was before everything she went through with Linton and Heathcliff. Because having Nellie there is really important for Kathy emotionally. Nellie provides a soft landing place for Kathy. Because Nellie is there to listen to Kathy and be kind to her, Kathy can now allow herself to be kinder. Who knew that just a little bit of love and kindness could go such a long way? But putting together her essential isolation and her better regulated emotional state, it makes sense that Kathy would begin to pay more attention to Hareton and to possibly regret how unkind she's been to him up to this point. Now, Kathy has relentlessly mocked and rejected Hareton, so it does take a while for him to forgive her. Kathy doesn't really help the situation by making excuses for her past behavior. She's like, I was miserable and bitter at everybody. But the turning point in their relationship comes when Kathy makes Hareton a symbolic present of a book, indicating that she is sorry for making fun of his illiteracy and that she wants to help him learn to read and write. Now, if Kathy were not a born people pleaser who wants everyone to love her, and if Hareton had not long harbored a very obvious crush on the beautiful Kathy, I don't think that these two could have found their way back to each other. But in the end, they do become friends and then lovers. They do develop what is probably the healthiest and most beautiful relationship in the entire book. Now, this is the second time that Kathy has gotten into a relationship with a cousin. Again, this is the 19th century. It was not considered weird to date or marry your cousin. Unlike her relationship with Linton, however, which was very much quasi-incestuous in that it was far more a caretaking sibling relationship than it ever was an explicitly romantic relationship, Kathy's relationship with Hareton is very different. For one thing, we see even in their early fights that they interact with each other far more as equals than Kathy and Linton ever did. Also, Kathy is still a teenager, and Hareton is in his early 20s, so their relationship is appropriately playful and lighthearted. Also, unlike so many of the other relationships in the book, Kathy and Hareton's relationship really centers around making each other better people. Kathy gives Hareton the education Heathcliff denied him, and Hareton makes Kathy a more empathetic, patient, and less classist person. Together, they are both better and stronger. As Lockwood thinks to himself, quote, "Together they would brave Satan and all his legions." In Kathy and Hareton's relationship, which is explored in chapters 32 and 33, we see a much more hopeful message emerge in the final pages of Wuthering Heights. It is, in fact, possible to become something more than the product of your environment. It is possible to break the cycle of pain and abuse. And it is possible to move on from the past and get a second chance at love and happiness. We don't have to be either a victim or an abuser. Our choices do matter, and we can choose to be better, happier, emotionally healthier people. And you know what? I think that's beautiful. Part 4. The Death of Heathcliff. You know who does not choose to be a better, happier, more emotionally healthy person? That's right. As we wrap up our third and final episode discussing Wuthering Heights, I want to bring our conversation back to the one, the only Heathcliff. Of course he's been busy kidnapping and torturing innocent girls and effectively killing off his only son by refusing to get him medical care in his final hours. But how is Heathcliff? How's he been doing, emotionally? The answer, surprise, surprise, is not well. In chapter 27, when Heathcliff kidnaps Nellie and Kathy, he is executing a carefully laid plan, one that he's thought through extensively. And yet, although he sees himself as this ultimate puppet master figure, he can just barely keep his temper in check. He's not just angry. He is furious enough that he seems constantly on the brink of murder. When Kathy tries to take the house key from his hand so, she can escape, he doesn't push her away. He, quote, administered a shower of terrific slaps on both sides of the head. Then, when Kathy begs him to let her go home so that she can see her dying father, Heathcliff, again, overreacts. Mr. Heathcliff, you're a cruel man, but you're not a fiend, and you won't, from mere malice, destroy irrevocably, I hate when people use this word, irrevocably all my happiness. If Papa thought I had left him on purpose, and if he died before I returned, could I bear to live? I've given over crying, but I'm going to kneel here at your knee, and I'll not get up, and I'll not take my eyes from your face till you look back at me. No, don't turn away. Do look. You'll see nothing to provoke you. I don't hate you. I'm not angry that you struck me. Have you never loved anybody in all your life, Uncle? Never? Ah, you must look once. I'm so wretched. You can't help being sorry and pitying me. Keep your F's fingers off and move, or I'll kick you, cried Heathcliff, brutally repulsing her. I'd rather be hugged by a snake. How the devil can you dream of fawning on me? I detest you." A short time later, Heathcliff tells Cathy, quote, "If I catch such a devil of a temper in your eyes again," presumably not reflecting on where she gets her temper from, we sense in this scene, in this chapter, that this is a man who is very far from an emotionless mastermind pulling the strings behind the scenes. Instead, this is a man on the brink, a man whose emotional and mental state is quickly spiraling into chaos. We see this most clearly in chapter 29, when Heathcliff comes to Thrushcross Grange after Edgar's death to fetch Cathy. When Cathy temporarily leaves the room to pack, Heathcliff casually reveals that just yesterday he dug up Catherine Earnshaw's corpse. I repeat, Heathcliff casually mentions to Nellie that he dug up Catherine Earnshaw's corpse. All I can really say is that the gothic vibes in this most gothic of books continue to intensify. We have had ghosts, toxic family dynamics, and quasi-incest. So why not start digging up the dead? However, aside from this sensational detail, chapter 29 is particularly interesting to those of us who struggle to understand Heathcliff, who really wish we could get inside his head and see why he makes the decisions that he does. Because in this chapter, we see Heathcliff speak extensively about his feelings and his mindset. And maybe to nobody's surprise, he speaks almost entirely about Catherine Earnshaw. Quick reminder, Catherine Earnshaw has now been dead for 18 years. He speaks about his, quote, strong faith in ghosts, and he describes how on the day of Catherine Earnshaw's funeral, he had the sudden feeling that her ghost was somewhere nearby. Quote, "I knew no living thing in flesh and blood was by, but as certainly as you perceive the approach to some substantial body in the dark, though it cannot be discerned, so certainly I felt that Cathy was there, not under me, but on the earth." He describes how he has never been able to let go of his belief that somewhere, just out of reach, just out of sight, Catherine Earnshaw has been haunting him for the past 18 years. "I felt her by me. I could almost see her, and yet I could not. I ought to have sweat blood then from the anguish of my yearning, from the fervor of my supplications, to have but one glimpse. I had not one. She showed herself, as she often was in life, a devil to me. And since then, sometimes more and sometimes less, I've been the sport of that intolerable torture. When I sat in the house with Hareton, it seemed that on going out, I should meet her. When I walked on the moors, I should meet her coming in. When I went from home, I hastened to return. She must be somewhere at the Heights, I was certain. And when I slept in her chamber, I was beaten out of that. I couldn't lie there. From the moment I closed my eyes, she was either outside the window, or sliding back the panels, or entering the room, or even resting her darling head on the same pillow as she did when a child, and I must open my lids to see. And so I opened and closed them 100 times a night. To be always disappointed, it racked me. Now, since I've seen her, I'm pacified a little. It was a strange way of killing, not by inches, but by fractions of hairbreadths, to beguile me with the specter of a hope through 18 years. By the way, this monologue does give us more insight as to why, in chapter 3, Heathcliff has such a disproportionate reaction to Lockwood's revelation that Catherine's ghost is, in fact, real. So, if the whole digging up Catherine's dead body thing didn't tip you off, Heathcliff is, how do I put this, not doing well. 18 years after Catherine Earnshaw's death, Heathcliff is still single-mindedly obsessed with her. At one point, Nellie refers to it as his monomania. Honestly, though, it goes even further than obsession, and to explain what I mean, let's put this conversation into the proper context. At this point in time, right, chapter 29, his old enemy, Edgar Linton, has just died. His only child, Linton Heathcliff, is actively dying, and he has just come into possession of Thrushcross Grange. And yet, the only thing Heathcliff can talk about is his belief that the ghost of Catherine Earnshaw has haunted him for the past 18 years. He's not even talking about his memories of when Catherine was alive. He is talking about the fact that he thinks her ghost is real. And I mean, okay, so the ghost of Catherine Earnshaw turns out to be real. Fine. Still, it can't be denied that Heathcliff is becoming increasingly detached from reality. For Heathcliff, nobody else is real. Only him and the ghost of Catherine Earnshaw. In chapters 33 and 34, this detachment from reality becomes increasingly pronounced. For example, in chapter 33, Heathcliff has this moment where he violently attacks Cathy Linton, and then he just stops. He had his hand in her hair. Hareton attempted to release her locks, entreating him not to hurt her that once. Heathcliff's black eyes flashed. He seemed ready to tear Catherine in pieces, and I was just worked up to risk coming to the rescue when, of a sudden, his fingers relaxed. He shifted his grasp from her head to her arm and gazed intently in her face. Then he drew his hand over his eyes, stood a moment to collect himself, and turning anew to Catherine, said with assumed calmness, "You must learn to avoid putting me in a passion, or I shall really murder you sometime." Afterward, he tells Nellie, quote, "There's a strange change approaching. I'm in its shadow at present. I take so little interest in my daily life that I hardly remember to eat and drink." Chapter 34, the final chapter of the book, shows us a Heathcliff who refuses to eat, refuses to sleep, and keeps tracking an invisible Catherine Earnshaw that only he can see. On the fourth morning of this self-destructive behavior, Nellie finds Heathcliff dead in his bed. She denies that it was suicide, but let's be real here, right? The only thing that Heathcliff really seems to want in the days leading up to his death is to be reunited with the ghost of Catherine Earnshaw. And you know what? After his death, he is. In the closing pages of Wuthering Heights, Nellie Dean tells us of running into a small child who tells her that he saw Heathcliff and a woman. After a lifetime of experiencing and inflicting pain, after a lifetime of passionate love and still more passionate hatred, Heathcliff, in the final pages of Wuthering Heights, dies and is reunited with Catherine Earnshaw. Part 5. So, what was the point? After 326 pages of death, violence, terror, and abuse, and also just a little bit of hope, we have come to the end of our Wuthering Heights journey. And I think we're left with just one question. What is this story of love, obsession, and revenge ultimately trying to say? I think that the ending of this book has a two-part message. Let's begin with the first part of the message, which is incorporated into Heathcliff's character arc. Across all 3 episodes of our deep dive, I've identified Heathcliff as the protagonist of Wuthering Heights, or at least the effective protagonist of the book. And as we've discussed, Heathcliff went from abused child to young adult hell-bent on revenge and not caring how much pain he causes in the process, to an adult who ultimately gives up his life to be reunited with the ghost of the only person he ever really cared about. In his quest for revenge, he's been an abusive father and husband, a kidnapper, a torturer, an animal abuser, and in the case of refusing to get a doctor for his dying son, very possibly a murderer. In the second episode of our deep dive, I questioned if somewhere along the way, Heathcliff began to lose his focus, if he began to lose sight of who or what he wanted revenge against. I asked then what Heathcliff actually wants, or if he even knows what he actually wants. And then, in the final chapters of the book, chapters 33 and 34, we get Heathcliff himself admitting that maybe his revenge quest has come to nothing, that ultimately it's been kind of pointless. After realizing that Hareton and Kathy have fallen in love, he says to Nellie, "It is a poor conclusion, is it not?" he observed, having brooded a while on the scene he had just witnessed. "An absurd termination to my violent exertions. I get levers and mattocks to demolish the 2 houses and train myself to be capable of working like Hercules, and when everything is ready and in my power, I find the will to lift a slate off either roof has vanished. My old enemies have not beaten me. Now would be the precise time to revenge myself on their representatives. I could do it, and none could hinder me. But where is the use? I don't care for striking. I can't take the trouble to raise my hand." That sounds as if I had been laboring the whole time only to exhibit a fine trait of magnanimity. It is far from being the case. I have lost the faculty of enjoying their destruction, and I am too idle to destroy for nothing. As this quote illustrates, and as Heathcliff himself repeatedly says, he regrets nothing. The night before his death, in fact, he tells Nellie that, and I quote, "I've done no injustice, and I repent of nothing." You know, not repenting of anything, that's one thing. Thinking that he's done no injustice is another thing entirely. This man didn't just lose his moral compass. He chucked it straight into the pits of hell. Despite all this, however, Heathcliff knows that he hasn't had any lasting impact on the world around him. His only child is dead. His wife is dead. Kathy and Hareton have moved past the trauma and abuse that they experienced at his hands, and everyone he even remotely cared about, whether positively or negatively, Catherine Earnshaw, Henley Earnshaw, Edgar Linton, is dead. In many cases, long dead. If there is a lesson we can take away from Heathcliff's character, it's that revenge is ultimately a self-destructive pursuit, that pain and abuse can become a cycle from which it is very difficult to escape, and that redemption is only possible through leaving the past in the past. Something else I want to highlight here is that all the way up until the end, redemption was possible for Heathcliff. A prime example of this is his relationship with Hareton Earnshaw. Despite everything Heathcliff did to him, despite refusing to give Hareton an education, despite forcing him to do hard physical labor on the farm, despite being consistently unkind to him, Hareton loves Heathcliff. In fact, Hareton tells Cathy not to speak badly of Heathcliff because this is his father figure. Heathcliff admits that Hareton is an admirable young man, that he doesn't deserve the treatment he's received, and that when he looks at Hareton, he sees a direct reflection of his younger self. Also, notably, Hareton looks exactly like Catherine Earnshaw. Heathcliff had the opportunity to raise Hareton as the son he always wanted. He had the opportunity to let bygones be bygones, and the opportunity to build a somewhat happy life for himself after losing Catherine Earnshaw. Happiness was always possible for Heathcliff, but instead he chose to hurt everyone around him, a decision that ultimately brought him neither happiness nor fulfillment. However, the second part of the message I think we're supposed to take away from Wuthering Heights is evident in Cathy Linton and Hareton Earnshaw's relationship. Both Cathy and Hareton have endured far too much suffering in their young lives. Hareton had lost both of his parents by the age of 6, while Cathy never knew her mother and lost her beloved father as a teenager. Hareton received no education, had to do hard physical labor, and was subjected to endless ridicule and mockery, mostly from Cathy. Cathy did have a privileged childhood, but as a teenager, her once happy life devolved into a nightmare of loss, grief, imprisonment, violence, and abuse. And yet, they overcame their trauma, biases, and hardships to find real happiness together. Wuthering Heights is a stormy book. I mean this both emotionally and also literally. Everyone in this book experiences tempestuous highs and lows, and many of the major events in the book are preceded or followed by dramatic storms. In Chapter 3, Lockwood is trapped at Wuthering Heights by a snowstorm, which is why he sees Catherine Earnshaw's ghost. And in Chapter 9, Heathcliff runs away from Wuthering Heights, an event which is followed by a very dramatic thunderstorm. The name Wuthering Heights is itself evocative of stormy weather. As Lockwood explains in Chapter 1, wuthering refers to, quote, the atmospheric tumult to which its station is exposed in stormy weather. Interestingly, in her 1850 preface to Wuthering Heights, Charlotte Brontë describes her sister Emily's book as follows, quote, in its storm-heated and electrical atmosphere, we seem, at times, to breathe lightning. Honestly, I think this quote should be on the cover of every copy of Wuthering Heights because it's such a perfect encapsulation of what to expect from the book, much better than the greatest love story ever told or whatever lies people like to tell about this book. Heathcliff himself is the personification of a storm, sweeping through the other characters' lives and leaving chaos and destruction in his wake. It's not a coincidence that the storm in Chapter 9, following Heathcliff's departure, is a particularly violent one. Quote, the storm came rattling over the heights in full fury. There was a violent wind as well as thunder, and either one or the other split a tree off at the corner of the building. A huge bough fell across the roof and knocked down a portion of the east chimney stack, sending a clatter of stones and soot into the kitchen fire. Heathcliff spends much of his life trying to achieve a similar level of destruction. Yet, after the storm's passed and Heathcliff has died, Wuthering Heights is finally at peace. In the final scene of the book, Lockwood takes a walk on the moors. I sought and soon discovered the 3 headstones on the slope next the moor, the middle one gray and half buried in heath, Edgar Linton's, only harmonized by the turf and moss creeping up its foot, Heathcliff's still bare. I lingered around them under that benign sky, watched the moths fluttering among the heath and harebells, listened to the soft wind breathing through the grass, and wondered how anyone could ever imagine unquiet slumbers for the sleepers in that quiet earth. What I think makes Wuthering Heights such an endlessly compelling book is that, like the original Catherine Earnshaw, it has kind of a double character. On the one hand, it is a deeply cynical story. The character of Heathcliff, in particular, is a relentless portrait of how revenge and obsession can destroy your life, how a victim can become an abuser, and how racism and classism are deeply entrenched systems that are intrinsically damaging for everyone involved. When we consider that Heathcliff ends his story by becoming so detached from reality that he eventually kills himself to be reunited with his ghost lover, Wuthering Heights can seem almost nihilistic. Then, on the other hand, we have Cathy and Hareton's relationship. And in this final scene, we are given a small but crucial ray of hope, a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. It's entirely possible that the peace might turn out to be temporary, that tragedy could still be in store for Cathy and Hareton. We don't know what the future holds for these 2 characters. And after all, they are profoundly different people from profoundly different circumstances. And yet, their happy ending is an indicator that people can change, that the cycle of abuse can be broken, and that even after all the storms and tempests of the past, peace is still possible. This has been a 3-part deep dive into Wuthering Heights from the 2 a.m. Book Review Club, where we have explored the characters, themes, and nuances of Emily Bronte's complex and layered narrative, and where we've been discussing why, 179 years after its publication, the world is still obsessed with Wuthering Heights. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey, and I hope to see you all back next week for more exciting book-related content.